Welcome to all of you to this webinar jointly organized by GPE and UNHCR. My name is Anna Tammy, and I'm an education specialist at GPE. It's a great pleasure to see so many of you joining us today. Before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping points. If you're experiencing any connection issues, please let us know via email at webinars@globalpartnership.org. We'll have a Q&A session after the presentations. Please share your comments and questions in the YouTube chat function, along with your name and organization. Also, the webinar is being recorded. Following this event, we'll share the resources associated with this session over email. Without further ado, I'm pleased to present our day's first speaker. Margarita Focas-Licht is the Chief of Effective Partnerships at GPE, and she will kick us off with some opening remarks. Over to you, Margarita.
Thank you so much, Anna, and good morning or good afternoon or good evening to all of you, depending on where you are. And thanks to everyone who's joining us for this discussion today. So let me start by introducing the subject that we're going to talk about. We know that all too often displacement is long-lasting, and children in refugee situation can be displaced for their entire childhood. This is an acute issue for many of GPE's 68 partner countries. 18 GPE partner countries host more than 100,000 refugees within their borders. Overall, GPE partner countries host 4 million refugee children, nearly half of the refugee children in the world. GPE is providing over $1 billion to strengthen education systems in more than 20 countries where refugees have access to schools. And we have also provided accelerated funding for refugee-related responses in Bangladesh, Cameroon, and Chad. At the Global Refugee Forum this past December, GPE committed to 3 things. First, to support inclusive and resilient education systems that will ensure quality education for refugees. GPE committed to do this through financial and technical support to countries to include refugees in their education sector plans and in order to include them in their systems. Through convening partners around policy guidance on the inclusion of refugees, and through intensifying advocacy on the right to education for refugees. Secondly, GPE committed to ensuring more and better financing to scale up quality education for refugees. We specifically committed to mobilize additional financing for refugees and host communities and to work with partners to ensure sustainable complementary financing. Finally, GPE made a joint pledge together with Education Cannot Wait and the World Bank for improved collaboration, coordination, and financing of education for refugees and host communities. GPE's collaboration with UNHCR has now been well established for several years. In fact, we signed a memorandum of understanding for collaboration all the way back in 2016. The MOU aimed to strengthen and support education for refugees through GPE processes at global and country level, as well as through GPE's funding, and to strengthen efforts to include better information on refugees and internally displaced people in education statistics at the global and country level. A recent stock taking of our collaboration so far showed progress in various areas, including examples where GPE and UNHCR together influenced education sector planning that targeted refugees' education needs. Refugees have access to national education systems in more than 80% of the countries where both GPE and UNHCR work. The stocktaking also recommended further actions to advance progress, and these areas include joint advocacy around global commitments, including the Global Compact on Refugees, jointly advancing a common understanding of refugee inclusion and defining parameters for refugee inclusion in education sector plans, and strengthen guidance for refugee inclusive education sector planning. I'm pleased that today we can begin to advance the work on some of these next steps by sharing this research with you. Anne will talk more about the research in a minute, but I wanted to say that we recognize the importance of further dialogue with the case study countries and engaging with them as partners around the findings from the study. We intend this to be a first discussion around the findings, and the presentation today will focus on cross-country findings. The report itself is currently undergoing final review and will be published in due course. Thank you so much for joining us today in this webinar, and I hope you will find it useful and look forward to a fruitful discussion. Thanks so much. Back to you, Anna.
Thank you, Margarita. So now we have our first presenter, Anne Scowcroft from UNHCR, and she has been a technical advisor with UNHCR since 2011, providing strategic support at the local, regional, and global levels. We're really happy to have Anne join us today. Over to you.
Thanks, Anna and Margarita. I'm not going to take up much time here so that we have lots of time for the presentation and the questions that come up. This research came out of formal and informal discussions with GPE country leads as the GPE-UNHCR partnership began to manifest at the country level. Why did our collaboration sometimes result in concrete change in the way that UNHCR works with the development education sector and sometimes not? And the reverse also. Why did our collaboration change how development education sector worked with UNHCR? And why does for refugees sometimes get permanently stuck in the humanitarian sector, despite how long people tend to be displaced, despite the need for investment in host community services, and despite what is known about economies of scale for education? Those are huge questions that hold many other questions. Much independent research on education for refugees examines what happens in the humanitarian sector and consequently builds on humanitarian education evidence and assumptions. But as Margarita pointed out, in most countries, there's no legislation that bars refugees from accessing national services. They're supported by governments and the development sector. So what kind of evidence base and analysis do we need in that nexus landscape? What assumptions have been brought forward to the nexus landscape that we might need to question? And what might we learn from examining avenues of research and analysis that consider the articulation of emergency and development approaches, financing, and policy? We would very much have liked to have had answers to all of those questions from Jigsaw's work, but at the beginning of any new avenue of inquiry, we have to start at the beginning. Because the beginning for refugee education is the emergency moment, that is what we asked Jigsaw to look at. What could we learn from countries that decide at the moment of an emergency to amplify their local systems to include refugees? What could we learn from countries that made that decision later? What could we learn from countries that support separate education systems for refugees? These are very blunt categories, but even so, a methodology for systematically collecting information that might begin to offer answers, a methodology for capturing what different stakeholders thought and did during the emergency moment of a refugee education response did not yet exist. One thing we learned for sure was that while emergencies generate a significant amount of documentation, we aren't collectively in the habit of analyzing and documenting our decision-making processes because things move so fast and change so fast. As a collective, that might be worth some reflection. We hope that the methodology and findings from this study might be adopted, refined, and expanded by other actors, especially those in academia, who take the long view and will seek peer review so that we can begin to build the nexus research base and agenda that we need for refugee education. What happens in an emergency resonates long after the emergency moment. What can we learn from it? How can we learn from it? The Global Compact on Refugees has an ambitious goal for education: position governments to include refugee children and youth in national education systems within 3 months of displacement. So what do we need to understand about how we respond individually and together in order to bring that to fruition? That is it. Thanks very much. Anna, over to you.
Thank you, Anne. I now turn to our researchers, Catherine and Megan. Catherine Gladwell has specialized in education and forced migration for the last 15 years. She's the chief executive of the education charity Refugee Support Network, and a board member at Jigsaw Consult. She has a degree from Oxford University, a master's in education and international development from the University of London, and is an honorary fellow at Winchester University. Megan Brucha is a senior researcher at Jigsaw Consult, where she manages research studies and evaluations regarding education in low resource contexts. Alongside her work at Jigsaw Consult, she is currently completing her PhD in the University of Cambridge in the Faculty of Education. Please, the virtual floor is yours, Megan and Catherine.
Thank you very much, Anna. I'll just ask that the presentation be put up. That's great. Perfect. All right, well, a very warm welcome to this session where we are very excited to be presenting the research findings from a cross-cutting analysis of 3 historical mapping studies that we have conducted on behalf of GPE and UNHCR. These studies explore educational provision for refugees from the outset of 3 major influxes of school-aged refugee children in Bangladesh, Rwanda, and Turkey. My name is Megan Brucha, and I'm a researcher with Jigsaw Consult, which Anna mentioned. We're a social enterprise based in London, and I'm the project manager for this study. I am joined today as well by one of the study leads, my colleague Catherine Gladwell, and I'll pass it over to Catherine now just to introduce herself. Sorry, Catherine, I think you're on mute.
Thank you, Megan. One day I will unmute myself rapidly. It's great to be here and have the chance to share some of our emerging initial findings with you. If we could just have slide 2, that would be great. So over the next 30 minutes, we're going to introduce the objectives of the study, its methodology, and also just briefly summarise some of the challenges associated with defining inclusion for this study. But we want to spend the majority of the time outlining the key findings, which we've broken down thematically. It's worth mentioning, as Margarita alluded to earlier, that this study hasn't yet been submitted. So although the format of this webinar is not kind of interactive per se, it's worth bearing that in mind during the question period. It may not be too late if you've got critical points that you'd like to see reflected in the report. And you'll also find our email addresses on the last slide. So if there is something that you'd like to follow up with us about, then please do feel free to get in touch. Could we have slide 3, please? Thank you. So this research, it aims to contribute to a greater understanding of the potential points of convergence between governments and the humanitarian and development education sectors, and look at how these shape the ways in which the educational needs of displaced populations and the communities that host them are addressed. And it does this by collating analysis and cross-cutting learning from the 3 country-specific studies that we produced, each of which had the following 2 key objectives that you can see here. So looking at what factors in the early stages of a refugee response seem to determine whether refugees are included into national systems as opposed to separate systems or parallel systems. And secondly, to identify factors for further study that can shed more light on what needs to be done for greater effectiveness and sustainability of refugee education responses from the emergency stage going forward. So that's what we have been trying to look at, and I'm going to pass back to Megan, who will talk you through the methodology and how we went about that.
Thank you, Catherine, and I apologize, you'll hear a thunderstorm in the background. The timing is impeccable as always. We felt that it would just be helpful to at least give you a brief summary of our methods to sort of frame the findings and make sense out of how we've structured them. I have the next slide, please. A number of primary and secondary research questions informed the shape and scope of the study, which were grouped into 3 clear themes. These are presented in the following slides. So starting with research area 1, government policy and leadership, there were 2 primary research questions within this theme. There are also a number of secondary research questions. However, in the interest of time, we've only included the higher level questions in these slides. So research question 1A is, how have different governments addressed the issue of whether and how to include refugees in national education systems? Research question 1B is, what can be said about how these approaches have affected the sustainability and relevance of the education offer for refugees? So for this, we were really interested in documenting any changes or shifts in policy and the factors that may have triggered those shifts. Can I have the next slide, please? Research area 2 is the contribution and engagement of partners. The first research question for this area is simply, or I suppose not so simply, how was the response influenced by government's engagement with humanitarian and development partners? And secondly, how did this engagement support or hamper an integrated longer-term approach for refugee education? We were really interested and really trying to unearth the effects of the actions and measures undertaken by humanitarian and development actors and their coordination during emergency phases of the responses. Can I have the next slide, please? And lastly, research area 3 is regarding development and humanitarian financing. And we asked how the education response was affected by this financing. Can I have the next slide, please? There were 3 main methods for this study. The first was a review of literature that was conducted on each of the study countries. Then the best bit, which our team enjoyed immensely, interviews were conducted with key individuals in each of the 3 countries. These interviews really sought to understand the critical incidents that took place from the outset of the responses, or actually even before that. We wanted to learn about the pre-crisis environment as well to factor that in. And lastly, we undertook a review of a coding exercise that was conducted by GPE on the inclusion of refugees in education sector plans. A summary of the key findings of this review is presented in our report. However, because we have limited time with you today, I won't be presenting these findings in this webinar, so you'll have to read the report to see them. Before passing it back to Catherine, I think it's probably worth briefly noting that the methodological approach was designed to be deliberately exploratory in recognition that there is no established way in which to conduct a historical mapping of this nature. We're therefore hopeful that our methodology itself and its successes and limitations also provides valuable learning for the sector, in addition to the value of the products and deliverables themselves. We will be including considerations regarding a replicable methodology as an annex in the report if you're interested in looking at that further. I'll now pass it back to Catherine, and if we could have the next slide, please.
Great, thank you, Megan. So before we launch into the findings, we thought it was worth just taking a minute or two to talk about the term inclusion. And this term, in the context of refugee children and education, describes the participation of refugee children in mainstream national education systems. Now, that might be clear to everyone on this call, but we just wanted to make clear that that differs from the term inclusive, which more typically describes education systems, approaches and programs that are explicitly accessible to children with special educational needs or disabilities. And that it is also distinct from the term integration, which in the context of forced migration typically refers to the process through which a refugee population and a host community combine into one in terms of service provision as a long-term alternative to the return of the refugee population to their country of origin, or indeed onward resettlement to a third country. So that is how we define and don't define the term here, but it's really important just to note that throughout the study, it did become apparent that there is a degree of lack of clarity among stakeholders, i.e. among a number of those interviewed and in their experiences around both the definition of inclusion and the way in which it should be operationalized in any given context. So even within that broad definition of participation of refugee children in national education systems, the term was informally defined in a whole variety of ways by respondents and in the documentation reviewed as well, from things like separate classes but shared curriculum, through split shifts, through to refugee and host community children studying the same curriculum together in the same classroom at the same time. And we see that continuum. And so in the absence of any kind of unilaterally accepted and detailed definition of the term. Organisations, governments and individuals, it seems, are using and understanding the term differently, shaped by personal convictions, contextual policies and practices, and also just particular agency-wide kind of de facto understandings and ethoses. Now that we've clarified how we are using the term in this research and the spectrum of things that has touched upon for our respondents, I'll pass back to Megan to unpack the first section of the key findings for us. Thanks, Megan. And if we could have the next slide for her, that would be great.
That's great, thank you. So yes, as Catherine said, we'll present our initial key findings from our cross-cutting analysis for each of the 3 focus areas for the research. I'll present the findings associated with government policy and leadership. I'll pass it back to Catherine, who will present the findings regarding the contribution and engagement of partners. And then I'll wrap up with the findings associated with humanitarian and development financing. Can I have the, oh, good. No, sorry, back a slide. I got ahead of myself. So focus area 1, government policy and leadership. Governments have addressed the issue of how to include refugees in national systems in different ways, which has, of course, in turn informed the sustainability and relevance of the education offer for refugees. There is unfortunately really no clear consensus regarding why shifts in policy happen, but the data from this study presents a number of key enabling and inhibiting factors that may be linked with the inclusion of school-aged refugees in host country national systems of education. I'll go through a brief summary of these enablers and barriers now. They may seem like teasers because we're short on time to really dive into any of them in depth. So I would again encourage you to engage with the report for further information in detail. Can I have the next slide, please? First, I'll run through enabling factors that may be linked to refugee inclusion in national education. But just a quick note about format, we've grouped these ones into 3 categories: before an influx, at the outset of a response, and during a response. Can I have the next slide, please? Of course, a country's educational response to an influx of refugees doesn't happen in a vacuum. Rather, it is informed and shaped by the pre-influx situation and environment. We found that future inclusion is best enabled prior to an influx of refugees when governments, 1, have a national policy on inclusion of refugees, 2, when there's a well-functioning national education system, which invariably links to how much the host country government has invested in education in general, and 3, when there's a history of recognition of refugees in the country. Can I have the next slide, please? At the outset of a response, we found that inclusion was best enabled when governments, 1, develop an early preparedness model and approach to refugee education. We really found that early action did seem to be a key to inclusion, and so this should happen at the beginning of a response, if not before, in partnership with other stakeholders. The second enabling factor is for governments to build towards inclusion from the outset of the response, even if a separate system is selected. The consensus from respondents was that educational provision for refugees should be designed in a way whereby they could be eventually included in the national system, even if there is no intention to do so immediately. This could really reduce the length of time to transition to an approach of inclusion, reduce associated costs, and really improve the likelihood of the transition to actually happen. Third, governments should have the Ministry of Education involved in the planning and delivery of refugee education programs, as opposed to having education as a service placed in the remit of a response ministry. Fourth, governments should be empowered to own the response through working in partnership with humanitarian and development actors. And by this, we mean that there should be an emphasis on the government as the lead in the response regarding refugee inclusion, rather than an agency as lead. May I have the next slide, please? During a response, we found that inclusion is best, back one slide. Perfect. During a response, we found that inclusion is best enabled when governments, 1, spend intensive time at the local level in the early stages of the response and throughout it, 2, critically assess the sustainability and relevance of the approach at the beginning of the response as well as throughout it. This will need comprehensive and reliable data and a way to systematically explore it. 3, design effective professional development for teachers and support systems, and critically do this before they teach classes in which refugee students participate. we found from the data that opportunities should also be sought for refugee teachers, and competitive incentives should be provided that are equivalent to teachers in the host country. And 4, integrate student data in one overarching EMIS. We found that the use of EMIS assessments and also education sector plans ensure government accountability and responsibility for refugee education. And these result in more effective and efficient coordination between partners. We would note here, though, that careful consideration needs to be made regarding data collection and associated refugee protection issues. Can I have the next slide, please? So now it's time to look slightly more briefly at the government leadership and policy factors that inhibit the inclusion of refugees in mainstream education. Can I have the next slide, please? Before a crisis, future inclusion is inhibited primarily when governments have historically been less welcoming to refugees. At the outset of a response, inclusion is inhibited when governments, 1, do not grant refugees a formal or legal refugee status, and 2, insist the response should be temporary, despite current data and research regarding the likelihood of protracted situations and the longitudinal nature of global resettlement trends. Can I have the next slide, please? During a response, we found that inclusion is inhibited when governments, 1, do not engage with agencies and request their expertise where needed, 2, face capacity constraints and high staff turnover, and 3, do not address rising tensions with the host community immediately. This really involves addressing concerns regarding perceptions of funding being moved away from host communities and reallocated to refugees, for example. And I'll now pass it back to Catherine to present our next theme for our findings. And if we could have the next slide, please.
Great, thank you, Megan. Wonderful. So this section is looking at the detail of how the response was influenced by government engagement with humanitarian and development partners, and how that engagement then supported inclusion and a longer term approach for refugee education or not. Different partners, i.e. development and humanitarian education actors, and we do note that it's not easy in every context to divide partners into those two separate categories, but nonetheless how different partners engaged with one another during the crises that we looked at in different ways and with various successes and challenges. And a range of actions and measures, or lack of actions and measures, were undertaken by humanitarian and development actors and appeared to have enabled or inhibited the inclusion of refugees in national education systems of the host countries. Of course, direct causality is not established here yet, so these findings should be looked at as indicative. And we'll start off by looking at the enabling factors, if I could get the next slide up for that. Thank you. And again, these are grouped into the same 3 categories as before. So if we could look at enabling factors prior to the influx with the next slide. Thank you. So we found that future inclusion is best enabled where partners really do leverage pre-established partnerships with government counterparts, building on current resources and scaling initiatives that have already been working and are already outlined in current work plans. And could we get the next slide, please? Thank you. So at the outset of a response, we found that inclusion is best enabled where partners find advocacy allies and decide on common ground. So this involves partnership mapping to identify who the champions are and who can really influence change, developing an appropriate advocacy strategy and calling on international delegates as advocacy allies as well, where that's possible. 2, where partners are meaningfully engaged with the government. I think we all know this, it makes sense, but it's worth clearly saying that where this could be achieved, it was a real strength of the response, and particularly notable in the Rwandan case, where the high level of appetite and openness from the government positively shaped the response. Thirdly, where partners understood the challenges in the host community as well as in the refugee community, so that the humanitarian response could be used as a way to strengthen the education system for everyone. And this should also include carefully reviewing the needs of the government and of the national education system at that time, so that it can be inclusion can be advocated for in ways that are really meaningful for existing government priorities, and presented as an opportunity to improve the host country system through incoming finances and help with the challenges that are common to both communities. And of course, that also helps in developing a holistic approach to partnership with the government that links back to the meaningful engagement that we mentioned. 4, when partners have a coordinating body that represents both the government and humanitarian community. And this is the case even when the cluster system isn't appropriate or possible. And there's a lot for partners to reflect on and consider about working within government-led responses, which are, increasingly what we see and what is needed as we see large-scale education responses required in contexts that are not typically humanitarian contexts and don't identify as such. And yet still we need to find ways to ensure that the international community is engaged and able to meaningfully participate in order to learn from previous or other current experiences. Okay, so moving on to look at enabling factors during our response, and if we could get the next slide for that, that would be great. Thank you. So firstly, during a response and as it progresses, inclusion is best enabled where partners conduct joint visits to camps or other key areas with ministry representatives. So joint visits in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh between UN agency staff and ministry members were very positively reflected on as a way to ensure that they were seeing through one another's perspectives and therefore able to engage in a critical and more meaningful dialogue with a common understanding of the context. Secondly, where partners leverage the knowledge and networks of local staff. And consensus from respondents was that the default currently is that decisions are made and key conversations are led by international staff. And we really do need to see a shift whereby national staff are provided with a platform to engage in strategy, as well as to advocate and champion for inclusion. Okay, so if we could go to the next slide, and we'll start to look at the inhibiting factors, which are clustered around the outset of a response and during the response. So the next slide, at the outset of a response, inclusion, we found, is inhibited when partners are unable to be sufficiently engaged, for whatever reason, with the Ministry of Education. Secondly, when they do not conduct partnership mapping, which can cause technical gaps between agencies with regard to education specialists. Third, when they don't conduct multi-year planning. And 4, when partners arrive in country and set up without liaising appropriately with, and where appropriate, actually joining forces with existing sector working groups that will have had a more development-focused mandate prior to the crisis. And could you get the next slide? And we'll look at inhibiting factors during a response. So firstly, we found that inclusion was inhibited during a response when partners are not able to translate advocacy strategies into on-the-ground actions. And a number of respondents suggested that at times during the different responses, the inclusion agenda, whilst understood and agreed with in theory by development partners, didn't translate on the ground because of the political nature of the response and fears around possible impact of such advocacy on development projects that were already underway in the host country and had been hard fought for in the first place. 2, we found inclusion is inhibited when partners face capacity restraints and high staff turnover, similar to the inhibiting factor for government bodies that Megan also talked about. And of course, this results in challenges for developing a coherent advocacy strategy, as well as, and this is really critical and can't be emphasised too strongly, poor documentation in terms of capturing decision-making processes and outcomes. And thirdly, when partners have short-term contracts with staff with specialised knowledge. And this is obviously very difficult, but there is a clear need noted by respondents to plan longer term for the skill sets that are needed to support the government and to liaise with other partners to ensure that the inclusion approach is sustainable and that the short-term needs are planned for, but in parallel with long-term needs. So that is an overview of the enabling and inhibiting factors from the perspective of the contribution and engagement of partners. And I'm going to pass back to Megan to talk us through donor financing.
Yes, thank you. So the third and final research area focuses on the relationship between development and humanitarian financing and refugee inclusion in mainstream education. Can I have the next slide, please? Funding seems to have played a role in increasing the prioritization of refugee education. For example, GPE funding being rechanneled into the Rohingya refugee crisis. However, as in the above sections, the strength of this relationship remains unclear, and further research is really needed to reveal the degree to which one affects the other. Can I have the next slide, please? So at the outset of a response, we found that inclusion is best enabled when, 1, refugee planning and budgeting for humanitarian and development partners are fully in sync with national and district planning priorities. In addition, there needs to be adequate space for ministries of education and other sectors to engage with this. Number 2, partners can clearly demonstrate the financial benefit of the inclusion of refugees in national education systems through the opportunity to channel funds to under-resourced host community education programs, improve infrastructure and maintenance, and to build national capacity. This should also be accompanied by data on the cost to national systems of not providing education to refugees. For example, healthcare, crime, competition for low-wage informal jobs, and so forth. Can I have the next slide, please? During a response, inclusion is best enabled when, 1, donors see their role in opening up opportunities to use the humanitarian response as a way to strengthen the education system for everyone, and 2, humanitarian financing is used appropriately to ensure that it is not dependent on long-term, but rather opens up opportunities for governments to adjust to new expenses. For example, in Rwanda, humanitarian financing offered time for the government to work teacher salaries into their new budget. Can I have the next slide, please? I'll now present the inhibiting factors. Thank you. It is considered that inclusion is inhibited when, 1, there is limited diversity in funding when it goes through one agency. Respondents felt that when this happened, it limited the diversity that was needed to address key gaps in the response, such as advocating for inclusion, offering post-secondary education for refugees, and aligning curriculum with national systems. 2, there is a lack of documented decision-making and processes in order to have sufficient processes to fall back on, as previously noted by Catherine as well. And 3, annual planning is done without adequately considering the long-term implications. This would likely mean that the emergency budget is not in sync with longer-term and broader conversations around inclusion approaches for refugee education. So that's a whirlwind tour through our findings, and I'll pass it back to Catherine now to, how are we doing on time, Anna? I realize we've used up our half hour.
Please keep going. We're doing fine, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll pass it back to Catherine now to review further considerations.
Great, thank you. So we're going to finish by briefly sharing some headline strategic considerations and examples of effective practice that came through the research that we just want to offer up for further inquiry or broader implementation. And again, they're grouped within the 3 research areas. So if we could have the, there already, wonderful. So some considerations for governments regarding policy and leadership. Firstly, government ministries in partnership with other stakeholders should develop an early preparedness model and approach to refugee education at the beginning of a response, if not before. And in that first phase of a response, there should be policy level conversations about the likelihood of the long-term stay of refugees and how to adequately support them in accessing their right to education and the implications for host communities. And if a parallel or separate system with a modified curriculum is selected, then a risk analysis of this should be conducted at that early stage. And if an integrated system is planned for, Then conversations around language learning, accelerated learning, to take Turkey as an example, it should happen early in the response to help develop a clearer continuum of education opportunities. And regardless of the path chosen, these conversations and the humanitarian response more generally should include the Ministry of Education, as opposed to leaving decisions regarding education provision for refugees to a separate disaster management or refugee response ministry, or whatever equivalent might be set up at the time. Secondly, teachers must be adequately trained and supported before teaching classes in which refugee students participate. And as Megan mentioned earlier, the opportunities that should be sought for them where possible should be equivalent to those of teachers in the host country. Thirdly, student data should be integrated in one overarching EMIS, and there's an interesting example from Turkey, the SABER EMIS, System Assessment for Better Education Results, established in 2008, that registers vast amounts of individual student and school data. And the kind of considerations around data protection that Megan mentioned notwithstanding, there are ways of using that data on in-school students, but also out-of-school students, that is invaluable to agencies who are looking to ground education interventions and objectives in reliable real-time data. Fourth, decisions should be documented to improve future practice, and this is, as you can see, a recurring theme throughout. But we do, kind of, as a sector, need to consider ways to improve how decisions are tracked so that lessons can be learned to improve future practice on decision making in crisis. 5, in the absence of refugee status, then there should be some form of a convention that still ensures education must be provided to refugees, and that this shouldn't solely be the decision of the host country government. 6, comprehensive, transparent and inclusive planning should take place across humanitarian and development agencies and with the government to develop strong and inclusive sector plans to avoid responding to crises in an ad hoc manner. And these should include budgeting for all levels of education. Okay, could we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So considerations for partners around their contribution and engagement. So firstly, education programme activities operationalised by agencies or government should include early childhood education, post-primary and tertiary education, and provision for out-of-school children and other marginalised groups. And humanitarian and development partners, as part of this, as well as governments, should look potentially to further examinations of Turkey as an example of a country that has provided and is providing a policy framework for such a huge displacement crisis at all of those education levels. And there can be some interesting learnings to come from that. Secondly, effective coordination and information sharing mechanisms between different stakeholders should be prioritised. And it seems that it's really important in that the coordination mechanisms manage any arising tensions early and understands how to present, frame and localise conversations that need to take place. And again, within those mechanisms, decisions should be documented in a way that facilitates future learning. And there is potentially a role for technology that could be explored in improving this. In addition, streamlined pathways should be developed within agencies that have separate sections for education emergencies and education for development. So at a minimum, those partners should form pathways of communication, so internal pathways of communication and collaboration, through to, if possible, considering merging those sections during a refugee response. And thirdly, humanitarian actors should ensure that government representatives, such as district authorities, receive adequate support that doesn't just address short-term needs, but enables them as well to plan for the longer term. And slide 36, the next one, around financing. Thank you very much. So firstly, a high-level transition category should be developed between humanitarian and development funding. So international donors should consider the introduction of this transition category between these two types of funding for education to better align financial mechanisms with the complex and unpredictable nature of many responses that we see. Secondly, multi-year funding should be provided to programmes where possible. So education in emergencies project funding, for example, should represent a minimum of 24 months. And of course, this is really critical in order to plan and measure the impact of sustainable education provision. And thirdly, host communities should be included in needs assessments. And again, this is a recurring thread, that combination of host communities and refugee communities, so that their needs can be included in donor proposals and short and long-term planning. And as a whole, the inclusion of refugees in mainstream education needs to be facilitated in such a way that governments with under-resourced education systems receive resources and increase capacity. And the inclusion of refugees should be clearly identified as an opportunity to improve the education system as a whole and presented as a contextualised package for governments. And lastly, donors should recognise their role in advocating for the use of a humanitarian response as a way to strengthen the national education system. And there really is a crucial role for donors like GPE regarding quality assurance and advocacy to reinforce the messages coming from the sector and to plan development with host country governments. And could we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. It's been a whistle-top tour of the findings, and as Megan said, there's a lot more depth in the overall cross-cutting report, but also in each of the 3 country case studies that will soon be available. And you have our contact details here if you want to follow up on anything that you don't get a chance to do in the time that remains now. So thank you very much, and I'll pass back to Anna.
Thank you so much, Megan and Catherine, for the really comprehensive presentation. Now we're lucky to have with us today Sarah Dryden-Peterson to offer some reflections about this work. So Sarah is an associate professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where she also directs REACH, an initiative to foster research and action on building welcoming communities and quality education in settings of migration and displacement. Her research connects practice, policy, and scholarship, and is strengthened through sustained collaborations with communities, NGOs, governments, and UN agencies, with a focus on low and middle income countries, particularly those that are conflict affected. Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Anna. Thanks all for inviting me to be part of this discussion today. I'm speaking today from Boston in the United States, and acknowledge and appreciate the homelands of the Massachusetts on which I live. I see people in the YouTube chat from every continent and in many roles in government, civil society, agencies, students, activists, and more. And I'm delighted to be able to learn from this GPE and UNHCR work in the context of our work that our teams are doing to foster quality education and welcoming communities in settings of migration and displacement at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and in our initiative REACH. I'm particularly excited by the group that's gathered today to discuss together the findings of these cases and the implications for continued work toward equity-focused and quality education for refugee children and young people. This work really illuminates what I see as the very hardest and most intractable challenges and questions in refugee education. And I wanted to talk about 3 of them today, and they're particularly evident in these cases. The first question is education for what future? Often there's a mismatch between the kinds of futures refugees imagine and plan for and the kinds of futures hosting nation states imagine and plan for. We see this tension playing out in the daily experiences of refugee children and young people in schools as they feel excluded or only tenuous belonging. What we hear from young people, this idea, it's like they're giving us the school so we can learn, but not to be established. It also plays out in the kinds of futures refugees imagine and education in a national education system prepares them for. Further education, work, participation that they find is frequently not possible when they graduate and are unable to work, unable to access capital, or to access further education. These are long-term, future-oriented questions, but we can see in findings presented today that they also hang over even the very outset of refugee responses and planning. The second question that I wanted to raise is this question of who is responsible. As we've seen across the three focus areas that you've presented, there's this constant negotiation over who is responsible for what dimensions of education, and critically, for how long. So at core, these are questions about how to share power and how to share resources, but also about where refugees belong. Typically, a nation state takes responsibility for the education of its citizens with the promise of all types of future returns, economic, social, political. The limited imaginators for refugees in a hosting country mean that this kind of investment is often not aligned. So we see situations in which there's a clear perception that refugee education is education by the state, but not for the state. So ensuring the right to education requires resources and new thinking about how to redistribute those resources across the rigid borders of nation states and over time. And I see this as one of the clear implications of this work. The third question I really see building from the first two, and it is this question you raised in the presentation of what is inclusion? Your work shows that the idea of inclusion is contested, defined differently depending on the place, and also I think the time. So we see that perceptions of inclusion reflect responses to the first two questions about education for what future and who is responsible. In particular, this work really points to the need for research, policy, and practice in refugee education to be more attentive to the differences between structural inclusion and relational inclusion. So structural inclusion centers on access to institutions and services and can be acted on by policies, partnerships, and financing, these focus areas. Relational inclusion, though, is a sociocultural process related to individual level development of a sense of belonging or connectedness, as well as group level social cohesion, all of which are essential to quality education, no matter where the imagined future is. So together, I really see these three questions about two key domains. One of curriculum, what is taught and how, and two of migration, who moves, where, and when, reflecting social, cultural, and political dimensions of education that are present in every nation state, as education, particularly education of the most marginalized, reflects broader social views of who belongs, for how long, and in what ways. Your work really raises up these critical questions of education for what future, who is responsible, and what is inclusion, and highlights both the points of convergence among actors and also the need to recognize the origins and outcomes of non-convergence or tension on the responses to these questions and the need to address them head on in discussions and decisions about refugee education. Thanks again for inviting me to be part of this discussion, and I'm looking forward to the broader discussion with those of you gathered around the world working on these issues. Back to you now, Anna.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for your thoughts. I'd like to give a few minutes to the other speakers to respond to your reflections. So let's start with Jigsaw, and then I'll also let UNHCR offer any further reflections. So Megan and Catherine, over to you.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you so much, Sarah, for those reflections. It's really helpful, and I think I just want to pick up on one thing, and because it resonates with something that a young person who's part of our youth advisory board at Refugee Support Network here in London said to me last week, and it's the phrase that you used that about the value of education no matter where the imagined future is. And this was a young person who was saying, there's so many possible options, some of which are appealing to me, some of which are terrifying to me in the future. And right now, I have no idea which one of them is going to become the reality. And I have no idea which one is going to become the reality for that young person either. And we ended up having a conversation about 3 things that he felt he needed, 2 of which we felt we could, together we could shape, and one of which felt more difficult but still needs to be engaged in. And the first was the question of building skills and through education gathering things that could be, the phrase that he used was, that could be put into a toolbox and taken out at different points in the future when they were useful, and the education was doing that. The second one was a sense of belonging that he was getting through doing that in the context of peers from his host country. And the third, which was the most difficult one, was this kind of political economy question of what will be the factors that either allow or don't allow him to make use of those things that he's putting into his toolbox in the future. And factoring that kind of political economy question in right from the start of designing education responses is just incredibly challenging because of the sheer number of unknowns that are being dealt with. And I think Sarah's reflections on that are really helpful. And we've got a long way to go, I think, in terms of how we work out what it really means to plan for multiple possible futures in a way that brings forward the best possible outcomes for young people when we don't know what the long-term future holds always. So I think that would be my reflection on what Sarah has said. And thank you, Sarah, for that.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Any other reflections from the speakers, either Megan or Anne?
Sorry, Anne.
Go ahead, Megan.
Go ahead, Megan.
Okay, sorry, I'll be quick. I was just going to echo what Catherine said, to thank Sarah for the comments. I mean, that's really helpful, and I think that we left this with more questions than we answered, as is typical in research studies of this nature. But I agree with the need for further research in all of these areas. And I know you talked about, what is inclusion, and this constant negotiation for who's responsible for which parts and for how long. And this really came out of the analysis alongside myriad other areas for further research, which we also detailed in the report. So there's lots more to do. Things, really fascinating things like identity and language, and there's so much more to dig into and to detail. And so it's very much sort of at the beginning of that. Over to you, Anne.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks, Sarah. I concur. I think that the comments that Catherine and Megan have made in response to your questions, your larger questions, Sarah, are really important. And for me, when I think about your questions and when I think about the work that we asked GPE and UNHCR asked Jigsaw to do, I realized that there is actually a question for me about how do we bring in the research that is done at the academic level, that is kind of more longitudinal and that is building over time, with our immediate need questions. So this research and the questions were designed around information that we felt we needed in order to act as agencies and as multilateral organizations in the refugee space. But there is all the longer term qualitative research that is being done by collectives like REACH, and how do we join together between academia and independent research to include some of those questions. So that's my general reflection there. We don't really have answers to your questions yet, but I'm wondering how we might address those questions together. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Anne, for your reflections as well. And thanks to all the participants for starting to write your comments and questions in the chat. I do encourage that you keep them coming and include your organization when you're commenting as well. That would be helpful. So we'll now start the Q&A portion of this session. And as moderator, actually take up researchers. And so, Megan and Catherine, what, in your view, were the greatest challenges to capturing what happened at the emergency stages of a response? If you were to engage in this kind of research for another set of countries, what information in the ideal world would you wish were available?
That's a brilliant question, Anna. Megan, shall I kick off and then you come in?
Sure, sounds good.
Okay, great. So a couple of things immediately spring to mind. One has already been mentioned, which was kind of high staff turnover. So there were a lot of situations when we had a relatively few respondents who had seen the length of an entire response, and when we did have that, it was exceptionally valuable. But we had a lot of cases where people were saying, oh yeah, I think there was a document about that, not sure what happened to it, someone else was working on that and they did some really interesting stuff, but we're not sure where it went to. And so that recording of decisions and making sure that things are documented for the next person who comes in, but also documented in a way that stuff doesn't just get permanently lost in grey literature that is, just for one particular agency, but that is recorded in such a way that it can be shared. It can be shared more broadly, and that there's a structured system for that. I think would be really useful. So, I mean, I think what would be so useful was if we're able to look at from this research what have been some of the key transition points and some of the key decision-making processes that have happened here, and look at, could we come up with some kind of framework from that people in other contexts could be asked to populate with their key decision processes at different times, and then get that broader overview? That would be really helpful. That might be a stretch. It's just anything to do with documentation is so challenging in that context when you're working 6 or not more days a week and completely flat out just dealing with the essentials. But when we come to try and learn for the future, it's just been so important. Megan, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I absolutely agree with everything you've just said. The lack of documentation was a bit of a barrier, but I mean, just to say, it might be a methodological question as well, just around the approach taken to understand the critical incidents that took place in each of the countries. It was quite challenging, especially responses that happened years ago. Our methodology worked to an extent, but and this might be part of what Anne was asking in terms of how do we sort of do research better on this. And again, a valuable learning from this is around the methodology, but the use of different techniques to really encourage structured storytelling to identify causal factors, things like this, where it was really challenging. And so, yeah, it could be more of a methodological query as well.
Thanks for those responses. So I'll now take some questions from the chat. Thank you for submitting these. So firstly, we have a question from James Oniango about the merits of inclusion of refugees in national systems are supported substantially by evidence. Were there notable findings that would explain why some governments are not keen on the approach? And I'll add here another question from Susan Durston, which is also a little methodological, about have you considered the role of wider global or regional politics, for example, the role of the EU in Turkey?
Sure. So I can go first, and Catherine, feel free to jump in at any point. Two very good, very difficult questions. Why are some governments maybe not keen in, in looking at the evidence that we have available on an approach of inclusion? This was a key question, and I mean, for a variety of factors that came up. And it's completely dependent on the country context, the timing, everything that we've sort of mentioned factors in some way into this. The engagement of stakeholders, the advocacy of actors, even the second question, which is the wider political landscape and environment. There are so many things that factor into it. And I think if we had that answer, it would make things a lot easier. But basically, it was highly complex. And I think a key area of learning was the differences in environments in the different country contexts as well, regarding the response to that in different ways. And so we've unpacked that a little bit in the report, but I think that is quite a critical area of further research as well. In terms of the wider role of regional politics, yes, to an extent, this was factored in and included, but there is always that balance to strike, I think, between the sort of the more the wider political landscape and things happening at local levels and district levels as well, and the sort of the relationship between those. And so while we looked at that a little bit,
that's obviously a huge work in progress, but I think there's interesting seeds of that come out in this research as well.
Thank you so much. I wondered if Anne could tell us a little bit as well about sort of the methodological framing of this research. I know you covered some of that in the beginning, but as we have received now some questions about these additional aspects that could be explored further, I wondered if you could elaborate at all about how we frame those questions.
Sure. I mean, it's so interesting, these questions coming up, and they're so valuable. And I certainly hope that anybody that takes the methodology going forward will feel free to add to it and explore other aspects, such as the regional dimension, such as the political dimension, that we didn't explore here. We struggled for quite some time, and we were back and forth with Jigsaw for quite some time, trying to figure out how to approach the methodology to answer the questions that we had. And it is experimental, and it is kind of a first gesture. It's exploratory. We are trying to figure out, how do we even ask these questions from a point of time, usually for Rwanda, for example, quite far into the future. These things happen nearly 10, the response that was examined happened nearly 10 years ago. So how do we even go back and ask those questions? Yeah, I'm excited to be able to kind of document the questions that are coming up in the chat, and to explore with Jigsaw after this presentation to see what kind of methodological recommendations will they make for anybody taking this up and moving forward with it. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Anne. I wanted to also turn to Sarah to reflect a little bit with us about the sort of methodology of this study and any sort of recommendations that you would have for this kind of research going forward.
Sure. Thanks, Anna. One of the things that I've just been thinking about as we have been talking about methodology and seeing some of the questions in the chat is just in what ways this kind of methodology, the analysis of critical incidents, might be useful not only for research like this one, but also for practice. So these ideas of analysis of critical incidents, even in real time, but also retrospectively, as a way to learn from situations and look at how other responses compare to a new context. I think this is useful not only in cumulative knowledge over time and making sure that we don't ahistoricize different kinds of responses, but also as a way of promoting discussion and collective action. I think, Jennifer Roberts, it was you mentioning in the chat this idea that decision-making in the moment often hides key areas that need to be discussed and addressed, but through comparative analysis of other contexts, it's often easier to surface some of those dimensions that are really importantly addressed in any kind of current context. So I guess this just makes me excited about the ways that this kind of methodology might be used, not only for research, but also for this kind of ongoing practice. And if documented in the ways that Catherine and Megan were describing, could provide a real resource in terms of organizations, all key actors really working together in emergency situations and planning for the future.
Thanks so much, Sarah. We still have some time for questions, so please do continue to share your questions and comments in the chat box. I noticed that there is one question about how to receive the report itself to comment on. So as Margarita mentioned in the beginning, the report is currently undergoing final review, and so it will be disseminated in due course. And also the resources from this webinar will be shared with all of you after the event. So in terms of next questions, can I just ask Margarita to talk a little bit about GPE's work on supporting refugees and the topic of refugee inclusion? There's a question related to that in the chat.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. GPE focuses on education systems and in particular on strengthening education systems and enabling them to reach all children, in particular the most marginalized children. Capacitating systems so that we move from systems that sort of support the upper quintile or the most well-off children who have the best resources, and to enable education systems to really reach those who need it the most. And we use our funding to leverage a holistic approach to this by bringing partners together at country level around strategies and plans, comprehensive strategies and plans for the education sector that are government-led, that have the buy-in of key stakeholders. And so the primary way and sort of where UNHCR and GPE have connected is that we focus on systems and including everyone, and we know that refugees is one of the groups that are not receiving education support. So what we can do as GPE is that we can bring partners together and use those levers of financing of inclusive policy dialogue and advocacy that we have to bring the issue of refugee education into the policy dialogue at national level in countries. And some of the research or the findings that were presented earlier talked about the importance of having that long-term perspective, of considering both the host community's needs as well as the needs of refugees, and of sort of acting short-term, I think, but planning long-term of what these opportunities, how to ensure that these opportunities are there. So GPE is a partnership. It's not just the Secretariat based in Washington, but what we work to do is leverage partnership at country level and work with partners, bringing partners together, ensuring policy dialogue is focused on vulnerabilities and equity issues, and to bring refugee children into the education system. And we work with countries from where they are. So, for example, in Chad, we have provided funding to both host communities and refugees, working closely with the government and UNICEF and other partners, because integration and inclusion there has been, the country has been ready for that. In other places, we start in a different space, and we try to work with partners to move towards more inclusive processes. So I know that's not very specific, but it's really it's based on policy dialogue, on focus on equity, on defining bottlenecks and challenges, and coming up with good strategies to address those, not from the global level, but really through the partners at country level who know the context the best, and giving voice. I should say we work very closely with civil society organizations. We have a big program called Education Out Loud, which is set up to mobilize stakeholders' voices and different give voice to different communities, also on the demand side of education. So hopefully we can also use those channels increasingly to give voice to refugee populations. So thank you, Anna, for the question.
Thanks so much, Margarita. We have some additional questions, which I'll now put to the whole panel, so anyone is welcome to chip in. So the question is, did the research in any way look at possibilities of coordination between the relevant countries, meaning the host countries and the refugees' home countries? And the person who is asking this is wondering whether this would play a role in enhancing the inclusion of refugees in the national education systems. And also, does the relationship between these countries play a role in either enabling or not enabling inclusion? So the floor is open. Please jump in.
Just to say that that's a really good question, but no, not in detail. It didn't look at this, but this is a really important area for the research, which I feel like is my default answer, but it didn't look at this in detail, just along the lines of curriculum into the country contexts. But the degree to which that relationship sort of shapes inclusion, I think it is important to go into detail on. But I appreciate the question.
Thank you. Sarah, I see you unmuted, so I'll let you.
Sure. Just one thought on this kind of a question too is that one of the things that's really emerged in the course of our research is just how much young people and refugee families connect their education in a host country to their home countries, and the kinds of social networks and relationships that are ongoing and naturally occurring, whether or not they're fostered by policy. And I think Peggy Levitt has some really interesting ideas about the kinds of resource environments that those who migrate create. And I think this is helpful for us as we think about these ways of coordination and conversation at policy levels to really build on the experiences of children and families, and the ways in which these cross-border relationships are already influencing education and experiences, as we think about ways that policy could reflect that, and rather than starting new kinds of structures, actually build on what communities have already begun.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I wonder now if I could have some concluding reflections from the panelists. I'd love to hear from you, just to share your sort of thoughts. You've listened to the conversation, you've read the questions, and the excellent comments on the chat. And so I wonder if you could offer just a final reflection to leave our participants with. So I'll start with maybe in reverse order, starting from Sarah. Go ahead, Sarah.
Great. Thanks, Anna. One of my reflections on the discussion that we've had today and the kinds of the three questions that I asked are just how it's clear that there aren't single answers to these questions. Education for what future? Who is responsible? What is inclusion? That you really encapsulated, Anne, as you were talking. And also the idea that these questions can have answers that vary over time, even for the same individual or the same organization, as you talked about, Catherine. I think important to these questions about regional politics and power that we've been talking about is also that young people are very aware of these regional and geopolitical dimensions of their education, of what they're learning, of who and how, who they are and if they can belong, which are of course central to learning and thus really inseparable from the kinds of systems level responses that we are talking about. So one learning that I'm coming away with is really this idea that we embrace the tensions and work through them explicitly rather than around them, in the context of clearly recognizing that the geopolitical realities that shape those tensions are daily also influencing the educational experiences of young people. Thanks, Anna.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Over to Megan and Catherine.
Sure. Catherine, I can start, and then you can take over. I have a lot of reflections, but I'll keep it brief. Firstly, to just say a very heartfelt thank you to the questions and to the participation of everyone. It's been really helpful, and the timing of this is great because we are wrapping up now, and we can use this to our advantage. And so I think I first also want to say that I absolutely agree with the level of complexity within every single research question for this study. There isn't an easy answer to these. And so it's important that research begins to engage with this and is critical of itself and its form and its structure to be able to do this better in future as well. And so I think that there was really helpful discussion around that. I mean, we'll be doing, I think I mentioned this during the presentation, but we'll be doing an extended methodology to really document and critically reflect on our processes and some of the issues that were raised in the discussion, including the efficacy of this particular framework and its effects on mapping the critical incidents, both in real time and retrospectively, as well as Sarah mentioned. And the importance of having sustainability and relevance sort of front and center of that conceptual framework. Lastly, I think I would just like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the interviewees who gave their time for this study and their incredibly valuable insights and expertise that we really appreciated and just really enjoyed learning from.
Thanks, Megan. Absolutely, would fully agree with all of that. And yeah, like Megan said, each interview that we did for this, for me personally anyway, was a really valuable learning experience. And I think we've continued that learning together this afternoon. So I guess for me, I would have three small reflections to put in at this stage, and it's the three things I think that have jumped out to me most through this process. And the first one is this thing around creative planning for multiple possible futures, and the way in which we can look to centralize the voices of young people in that, and finding better and more creative ways to make sure that the responses that we are initiating or supporting are things that are valuable to those young people in that place at that time. And then from that, looking at ways that those things can be grown and expanded. The second thing would be the involvement of host communities from the start, and I think helping governments to just see that kind of basic concept of a rising tide that catches everyone, and thinking, in all of the countries that we're working in, whether they're high resource or low resource, there are huge groups of disadvantaged young people, refugee or not, and that need to address education inequalities across the board for refugee young people and others is really pressing, and anything that can be done that uses a refugee response to bring about change across the board, I think is just going to be hugely valuable. And then thirdly, just documentation.
Thank you, Catherine. Margarita, please.
Thank you, Anna. And I just want to start by thanking the presenters and as well as all the people who have come with questions. It's been a really interesting discussion. I think from my perspective, so many important issues have been raised. The political economy is different in every context, and so I think that from a sort of an agency partner perspective, it's important to build knowledge around that political economy, to find the right opportunity at the right time, to leverage partnerships and trust, to have really good dialogue about how to move things forward, and work in complementarity. We're different partners for different mandates, different resources, and different roles that we can play to bring into the dialogue to move things forward. I really want to emphasize the importance of engaging stakeholders at country level, and I noted the importance of sort of having staff who've been in the context long term. I think in humanitarian work, partners often come in and out very quickly, and so having that dialogue between longer term development and humanitarian work to ensure sort of the longer term understanding, to bring different stakeholders together to find solutions, is really important. And this, I think, is this particular initiative is also an example of how we can complement that from the global level through doing research, building knowledge to feed into that country level dialogue. So overall, I think it's been a really interesting conversation. I look forward to the final study and look forward to continuing the discussion around these issues. So thanks to everyone who's joined, and back to you, Anna.
Thanks. Anne, please go ahead.
Yeah, I would echo everybody's comments, Margarita's in particular. I think this is such an opportunity for us to really begin to engage the conversation across the humanitarian and development sectors. And certainly with the UNHCR team, and I hope in collaboration with GPE, we can begin to consider, especially that question of how do we document those historical incidents? How do we keep track of our decision-making process, and how can we use that information? Even though each context is different, how can we use that information to better collaborate with governments and better support governments in whatever decisions that they have taken? Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for taking the time to join this webinar today. This is a conversation we certainly hope to continue, and I encourage you to keep an eye out for the report once it's published. So thank you to all the speakers as well for your insightful interventions and for all the comments and questions from all our participants. We'll now close this webinar. Stay safe, thank you, and goodbye.